In this recording, we're going to talk about terms of trade and how the relative supply curve is going to shift due to growth, right? And we'll talk about several kinds of growth. And we'll ask a few questions whether the growth in foreign country valuable for us or growth in our own country valuable for us. So those are the questions which we need to answer in this recording. So terms of trade is the price of exports to price of imports. Simple. So it is basically your price of exports to price of imports. So keep this definition in your head. We'll be using it. That is what terms of trade is, right? We are assuming that there are two countries, home and foreign. And these two countries, they have the same tastes and preferences. And because they have the same taste and preferences, so we can assume that the relative demand curve is downward sloping. So you have the same relative demand curve for the world. Relative demand curve for world, right? So home is producing how much of cloth? QC. How much of food? QF. Foreign is producing how much of cloth? QC star. How much of cloth? QF star. And the relative supply of cloth is the amount of cloth produced by home plus amount of cloth produced by foreign upon amount of food produced by home plus amount of food produced by foreign, like this. And the relative demand is basically the amount of cloth demanded by relative demand for cloth, amount of cloth demanded by home, amount of cloth demanded by foreign upon amount of food demanded by home plus amount of food demanded by foreign, right? And we say the equilibrium relative price would be at the point where the relative supply of the world would be equal to the relative demand of the world. So relative demand curve for the world is same, right? There are no changes in what you call preferences. So relative demand curve is same. And at equilibrium, the amount of cloth which the home is going to export is equal to the amount of cloth which foreign is going to import. So at equilibrium, QC minus DC. So this is the amount of exports of cloth. So this is what is produced by home of cloth, demanded by home of cloth. So supply minus demand, that is exports of cloth by home, is equal to DC star minus QC star. So foreign is demanding more of cloth and producing less of cloth. So these are the imports. So exports of cloth by home is equal to imports of cloth by foreign is equal to imports of cloth by foreign. Similarly, the amount of food which home is going to import is equal to the amount of food which foreign is going to export. So the import of food by home is equal to export of food by home, right? Import of food by home is equal to export of food by home. So this guy is the relative supply of cloth in home, right? This guy is the relative supply of cloth in foreign, So because in foreign less cloth is being produced, so the relative supply curve is up because the relative price of cloth is higher in foreign, and in home more cloth is being produced, so the relative price of cloth in home is lesser. This is all before trade. So with the trade, the relative price is going to be between these autarky points. These two are autarky points. We have done all this in the earlier classes also. This is the relative supply curve of the world. This is the relative supply curve of the world. So this is the relative quantity of cloth. This is the relative price of cloth. We have done all this. I've just revised it. Now I'm moving on. The shift in the relative price. So when you say about something about economic growth, so economic growth is going to be an outward shift in the outward shift in the production possibility frontier, right? Now, this shift in the production possibility frontier could be due to the improvement in technology, right? Or it could be due to the increase in the factors of production or the endowment of the factors of production within economy. Maybe we have got more labor now. Maybe India, of course, India is in demographic dividend right now. So it has more working age population. So the resources which can work, they have increased right now. Similarly, or the technology would have improved, or both, whatever could have happened. And when you say growth is biased, so growth, you call growth as biased if it is biased towards one particular sector. It could be a cloth sector, it could be food sector, whichever. So if it is proportionate in both the sectors, then the growth is not biased. But sometimes it happens that with growth, one of the sector is growing, one, other sector is reducing, two, or one of the sector is growing, one, other sector is also growing, but not as equivalent as the first sector. For example, so I'm going to draw a PPF which is more biased towards cloth, right? Like this. Huh? So where will you be producing? Yeah, this is what my PC by PF is. And I'm producing this much of cloth, I'm producing this much of food. QC1, QF1, right? Okay. Then the other thing is, now supposedly this thing has increased. This thing has increased. And of course, what will happen at an unchanged relative price? At an unchanged relative price. So when I say unchanged relative price, those doesn't look like relative price. Something like this. So at an unchanged relative price, PC by PF dash or 1 or whatever you want to say. PC by PF 1, PC by PF. And why should I say 1, 2? Because they are both same. At an unchanged relative price, what has happened is, now you are definitely producing more cloth, but you are producing little less food. You are definitely producing more cloth, QC2, but you are producing less food. So the growth is strongly biased if it is going to increase the production in one sector and going to decrease the production in the another sector. That is strongly biased growth. There can also be something like this, mildly biased growth. So it is again biased more towards the cloth axis, and This is this. This is this. And what happens is your growth has occurred. Growth has occurred. And with growth, what has occurred is this. So let me just mark the initial points. Tuck, tuck. QC1, QF1. And with growth, both sectors have increased. But the increase in one sector is more than the increase in the another sector. Increase in one sector is more than the increase in the another sector. So here, cloth sector is increasing and food sector is decreasing. Here, cloth sector is increasing, food sector is also increasing, but the increase in cloth sector is more than the increase in the food sector, right? So what is going to happen? The growth is biased towards cloth, right? In this case, growth is biased towards cloth, whether it is a strongly biased growth or a mildly biased growth, right? Or whether it happens in the domestic country or the foreign country. So what is the relative supply of the cloth? QC upon QC plus QC star, QF upon QF star. So if it is a strongly biased growth, so C is increasing, right? Fine, very good. This is increasing. And this is falling. So this guy is increasing. Here, this is increasing more than this increase. So again, this guy is increasing. Your relative supply of cloth is going to increase. Relative supply of cloth. Write it like this. Right. Relative supply of cloth is going to increase. Or you can say world relative supply of cloth is going to increase ultimately. So assuming these two are not changing, whatever. So what is going to happen? When the relative supply of the cloth is going to increase, what is going to happen? The supply curve is going to shift downwards. So supposedly I'm very quickly drawing this. This was my relative demand curve. This is my relative supply curve. When the supply curve is going to shift, it is going to decrease the relative price of the cloth. So earlier relative price was this, now relative price is this. So when the relative price of cloth is going to fall, that means PC by PF is falling. PC by PF is falling. So it means what? The terms of trade for the home country has worsened. No? Terms of trade of home country worsens. And what has happened is basically if so terms of trade in the home country has worsened because of this increase in economic growth, and which is strongly biased or mildly biased. One thing. They can also be exposed. They can also be exposed export bias growth. Now, what do you mean by export bias growth? Export bias growth is that economic growth is going to increase the production of the commodity in which the country is going to export. So in home country, export bias growth is that growth which is going to increase the cloth production. In foreign country, export bias growth would be which is going to increase the food production, right? So, and disproportionately biased. So bias would mean disproportion. That is, in home country, export bias growth would mean disproportionately increasing the amount of cloth production in the home country. In foreign country, export bias growth would mean disproportionately increasing the amount of food production in the foreign country. So you have the relative demand curve. And you have the relative supply curve initially. Now, because of the export bias growth, when it is going to increase QC, so when QC is going to increase, this expression is going to increase, and hence basically this guy is going to increase. Relative supply curve is going to shift downwards. So what happens is that the relative price is going to fall. So earlier relative price was PC by PF 1. Now relative price is PC by PF 2. Right? So when PC by PF has decreased, that is price of the export good upon price of the import good in home country, this ratio has decreased. It means home terms of trade have decreased. In home, terms of trade has decreased. Okay. What about foreign? What about foreign? So this was my relative demand curve, which is same, and relative supply curve, which is like this. PC by PF1. Now food buys growth in foreign. Food buys growth in foreign. So it is going to increase the amount of the food in foreign. When it is going to increase the amount of the food in the foreign, so what is going to happen? Means less cloth is going to be produced in foreign. So the relative supply of cloth in foreign is going to decrease. Relative supply of cloth in foreign is going to decrease. PC by PF2, right? PC by PF2. So, or you can say PC by PF star or whatever you want to say, that is going to increase, because if QF star is going to increase, this is going to fall, right? So when PC by PF has increased, that is relative price of cloth has increased. So that would mean by same token that PF by PC has reduced. For foreign, it is food is the exported commodity. So price of export upon price of import is falling. So the foreign terms of trade is going to fall. Foreign terms of trade is going to fall. Okay. Then you have import bias. So import bias growth would be what? Import bias growth is going to be which is going to increase the amount of the production of the imported good disproportionately, that growth. So you have the relative demand curve. You have the initial relative supply curve. You have the initial relative price. PC by PF 1. So what happens is that when it is an import bias growth, so in the home country, the production of food is going to increase and the production of cloth is going to fall. So when the production of cloth is going to fall, it is going to reduce the relative supply curve like this. And the PC by PF is going to increase. So what is going to happen? In home country, PC by PF is increasing. That is price of the export good upon price of import good is increasing. That means in home country, terms of trade are increasing because of the import bias growth. Then you have the relative demand curve. You have the relative supply curve in foreign. And you have PC by PF 1. And now it is the cloth buys growth in foreign. So foreign is importing cloth, and there is an increase in the cloth buys growth. So the relative supply of cloth is increasing. This is going to decrease the relative price of cloth. So PC by PF is falling. That would mean PF by PC is increasing. That would mean the price of export upon price of import in the foreign country is increasing. So that would mean terms of trade is increasing in the foreign country. Terms of trade is increasing the foreign country. So if there is a growth in the another country, so if there is a growth in the foreign country, is this a good or bad for home country? That's the question. That's the question. So the point is, if there is an export biased growth in the foreign, right? Export bias growth in foreign. Makes us better off. Think about it. So when there is a food bias growth in foreign, no, when there is a food bias growth in foreign, so PC by PF is increasing. So their terms of trade is going to fall. And because of their food bias growth, PC by PF is increasing. So that means it's good for us. PC by PF increasing means price of export upon price of import for the home country is going to increase. It is good for us. So it is going to increase the terms of trade for the home country. It's going to increase the terms of trade for the home country. While if there is an import bias growth in the foreign country, so if their terms of trade is going to increase, then it is going to decrease the, don't think that they are happening at the same time. So I've just given you different examples. So when there is an import bias growth in the foreign country, that is going to harm us because their terms of trade will increase and our terms of trade is going to fall. Export bias growth in foreign will make us better off. And import bias growth in foreign will make us worse off. Will make us worse off, right? You have done this data. When in the foreign country, there is an export bias growth. So PC by PF is going to increase, which is good for us. When there is a food bias growth in the foreign country, when there is a import bias growth in the foreign country, cloth bias growth in the foreign country, PC by PF is going to fall, right? So if they are able to produce what we are exporting, it is bad for us. If they are producing more what we need, it is good for us. Then is the growth in own country more or less valuable when we are a part of the closely integrated world economy? So again, if you look at it this way, economic growth in own country is less valuable if it is export biased. As it reduces terms of trade. So if there's an export bias growth, so if there is an export bias growth in my country, so PC by PF is falling, terms of trade are going to fall. If there is a growth which is going to increase the cloth production in my country, that is going to be less valuable to me. And right, and it is more valuable if it is import biased. So whatever I'm importing, if I'm able to produce more in my country, that is good for us, no? And here also you have seen, if it is an import bias growth, so in my country, I'm able to produce more of food. PC by PF is going to increase. That's what you have seen. Terms of trade is going to increase, right? So this is what I wanted to do in this recording beta. Thank you.